Top 1. The Eleusinian Mysteries. Imagine you are Cicero, not the nervous student or the young advocate, but Cicero at the height of his powers, Rome's greatest living order, a man who has argued before emperors, written the architecture of Western law, and survived civil wars that destroyed better men. You are not easily frightened, and yet, here on a torch-lit road 14 miles west of Athens, you are terrified. You are walking in a procession toward a sealed stone hall, and you have been told the conditions very clearly. What happens inside cannot be spoken of, not to your wife, not to your children, not under torture, and you will keep that oath. So will Plato, so will Marcus Aurelius, so will Augustus Caesar himself. For nearly 2,000 years, every major philosopher, general, and emperor in the ancient world entered a single building on the coast of Greece and came out permanently changed, and not one of them ever said what happened inside. This is the sanctuary at Eleusis, and it may be the longest-running secret operation in human history. The site was excavated beginning in 1882 by the Greek Archaeological Society under Demetrius Philios. What they uncovered was the Telesterion, a roofed hall with stone seating carved into the hillside capable of holding approximately 3,000 initiates simultaneously. George Milonas, the Harvard-based scholar who published the foundational modern study in 1961, spent decades trying to reconstruct what happened inside. He couldn't because the oath worked. Not one first-hand account of the inner ceremony survives across 1,800 years of continuous practice. That is not a gap in the record. That is an enforced wall. The mysteries ran from approximately 1500 BCE until 392 CE, when the Roman Emperor Theodosius III forcibly closed all pagan sanctuaries. Nearly 2,000 unbroken years. The confirmed list of initiates reads like a roll call of Western civilization: Plato, Sophocles, Pindar, Cicero, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, Augustus. We know they attended because they said so obliquely, carefully in language that described transformation without describing the mechanism. Cicero wrote only that he had learned at Eleusis how to live and how to die with hope. Plato's writings echo a cosmology whose source he never named. The central sacrament was a barley-based drink called the kykeon. In 1978, ethnomycologist R. Gordon Wasson, chemist Albert Hofmann, the man who first synthesized LSD, and classical scholar Carl Ruck published a study called The Road to Eleusis, arguing that the kykeon was laced with ergot, a fungal parasite of barley containing lysergic acid amide, a compound chemically adjacent to LSD. Then more recently, archaeochemist Jordi Juan Tresserras identified alkaloid residues consistent with ergot contamination in ritual vessel fragments found at a Spanish site associated with the mysteries. Physical evidence, not just theory. The Telesterion itself was rebuilt at least 6 times over its history, each time larger, suggesting accelerating demand for initiation. Disclosure of the mysteries was a capital offense under Athenian law. In 415 BCI, the general Alcibiades was tried and sentenced to death in absentia, specifically for allegedly parodying the rites at a private dinner party. He fled Athens and never returned. The priesthood controlling the mysteries, the Eumolpidae and Charikes clans, held their positions hereditarily, passing the office of Hierophant within the same bloodlines for over a millennium. They controlled who got inside, and who got inside controlled the ancient world. Classical scholars argue the mysteries were sophisticated religious theater, a staging of the myth of Demeter and Persephone that used torchlight, fasting, sound, and emotional catharsis to produce spiritual transformation. The secrecy was the product itself. The exclusivity created the awe. Political figures attended because it was culturally expected, the ancient equivalent of a state religion. That explanation is fair. It's probably partly right. But theatrical staging doesn't explain why trained rhetoricians returned from the Telesterion and wrote about it in the specific language of irreversible change. It doesn't explain why the same priests who controlled initiation also controlled which political candidates received the sanctuary's symbolic blessing. And it doesn't explain why Rome's emperors, who systematically dismantled every other Greek mystery cult they encountered, specifically protected Eleusis for 3 centuries after the conquest of Greece until a Christian emperor finally destroyed it by force. Some researchers ask whether the Eumolpidae were running something closer to a pharmaceutical state, controlling access to a consciousness-altering compound, and through that access, shaping the philosophical and political formation of every leader the Mediterranean world produced. Was the Kykeon a tool of initiation, or was it a tool of allegiance? And when Theodosius closed the sanctuary in 392 CE, was he ending a religion or dismantling a 2,000-year influence operation whose architects had long since turned to dust? We will probably never know. The Telesterion is ruins now, buried beneath an industrial suburb of Athens. The Eumolpidae are gone. The Kykeon formula died with the last Hierophant. All that remains is the testimony of the people who came out changed in their unanimous, unbroken silence. Top 2, the cult of Mithras. The underground temples of Rome held a different kind of secret. No drink, no sealed hall, no priestesses, just a low stone ceiling, the smell of torch smoke, and a room full of soldiers who all recognized each other and wouldn't tell you how. The cult of Mithras. The room is small enough that you can touch both walls with your arms outstretched. The ceiling is arched and painted with stars. There are no windows. The only entrance is the door you came through, and it is now locked behind you. On the stone benches that run the length of the room, men sit in silence. Only men, their faces lit by a single torch. They all hold the same rank insignia. They all serve in the same empire, and they belong to a brotherhood whose rituals, membership lists, and theology were so completely erased that after 4 centuries of excavation, we still cannot read a single page of their scripture. Not one word. This is a Mithraeum, and over 420 of them have been found scattered from the northern edge of Hadrian's Wall in Britain to the Syrian desert at Dura Europos, the entire geographic breadth of the Roman Empire. The London Mithraeum was discovered in September 1954 during post-war rebuilding work on Walbrook Street. It was the largest Mithraic find in Britain. Archaeologist W.F. Grimes led the excavation, and the site drew 30,000 visitors in its first week of exposure. Ordinary people who had never heard of Mithras standing in a queue to peer into a sealed room that had been buried for 16 centuries. Every Mithraeum excavated follows the same layout: a central nave, 2 flanking benches for communal meals, and at the far end, the Tauroctony, a carved image of Mithras killing a bull surrounded by a specific cast of figures that never varies. Not one Mithraeum deviates from this program. Not one across the entire empire, with no surviving canonical text to enforce uniformity. The 7 grades of initiation, Corax, Nymphus, Miles, Leo, Perses, Heliodromus, and Pater, were documented by Saint Jerome in 384 CE. They translate as raven, male bride, soldier, lion, Persian, sunrunner, and father. Historian Roger Beck, in his 2006 study, The Religion of the Mithras Cult in the Roman Empire, demonstrated that the Tauroctony is not simply a religious image. It is a precise star map. The figures surrounding the bull killing correspond to 7 constellations simultaneously visible in approximately 4000 BCE, implying the cult preserved astronomical knowledge from a tradition far older than Rome and far older than any Roman soldier claiming to have invented it. Confirmed Mithraic initiates include the Emperor Commodus, documented by Historia Augusta. Emperor Julian, called the Apostate, wrote openly of his devotion to Mithras, and in 307 CE, Diocletian, Galerius, and Licinius jointly dedicated an inscription at Carnuntum on the Danube, explicitly calling Mithras the patron of their empire. 3 co-emperors, 1 public dedication to a god whose worshippers supposedly met in secret and left no texts. The maximum capacity of most Mithraei was between 15 and 40 people, a deliberate architectural constraint, suggesting the cult was designed for cell-based organization, not mass membership. Every excavated site shows evidence of communal dining on the initiation benches, animal bones, amphorae, ceramic servingware. The meal was ritual, repeated, and binding. It created loyalty across military postings, across provinces, across the borders of individual legions. You could walk into any Mithraeum in the empire and be recognized by strangers who were effectively colleagues. When Theodosius criminalized non-Christian worship in 391 CE, Mithraic temples were not simply closed. They were buried. Christian churches were constructed directly above them in at least 11 confirmed locations in Rome alone. That's not closure. That's concealment. Scholars like Manfred Klaus argue Mithraism was essentially a fraternal organization, the ancient equivalent of an officer's mess, providing soldiers with community, shared ritual, and an afterlife framework during the psychological demands of imperial service. The secrecy was standard for mystery cults. The military skew simply reflects that soldiers had the leisure and income for initiation fees. That explanation is reasonable and probably contains real truth. But a fraternal organization doesn't map its promotion system onto constellations from 4000 BCE. It doesn't build its meeting rooms underground when surface construction was significantly cheaper. And it doesn't get systematically buried rather than simply abandoned when a new religion wins, unless someone was specifically afraid of what those rooms contained or what they represented. Some researchers ask whether Mithraism was less a religion and more a parallel command structure, an empire within the empire whose 7 grades allowed officers across different legions to recognize each other's rank instantly, independent of the official military hierarchy. If the emperor held the patter, loyalty ran sideways through the empire, not just vertically upward toward the throne. Who commanded that lateral network? And where did their texts go? The answer in every case is the same: destroyed, buried, or never written down to begin with. A brotherhood that left no fingerprints except for 400 rooms full of the same star map pressed into stone, waiting to be dug up. Top 3, the Amun priesthood of Karnak. From the underground temples of Rome, we cross the Mediterranean south to the banks of the Nile, where a different priesthood didn't bother hiding in the dark. They stood in the most visible buildings in the world in full sunlight and quietly stole an entire civilization from the inside. The Amun priesthood of Karnak. The pharaoh is a god. That is not a metaphor or a political convenience. It is the structural foundation of Egyptian civilization, the organizing principle that held the Nile Valley together for 3,000 years. The pharaoh does not merely rule. He is the intermediary between cosmic order and human life. His authority is absolute, his person sacred, his word the literal voice of the divine on earth. Now imagine sitting across from that god and explaining to him very carefully that the temple owns more land than the palace, employs more people than the army, controls more grain than the treasury, and that if he wishes to issue a public decree, he will first need the oracle's approval. The oracle naturally is also yours to manage. This is what the high priests of Amun achieved. Not through rebellion, not through violence, but through paperwork, patience, and 6 centuries of institutional accumulation, so gradual that by the time anyone noticed, it was already too late. The evidence is preserved in a single document, the Harris Papyrus, a 133-foot administrative record from the reign of Ramesses IV, discovered in a Theban tomb in the 19th century and now held in the British Museum. The numbers it contains are staggering. By the reign of Ramesses III, around 1150 BCE, the temples of Egypt owned approximately 750,000 acres of agricultural land, 433 gardens, 83 ships, 46 construction yards, and 65 towns. Temple estates employed an estimated 81,322 people. The scale is not a religious institution, it is a parallel state. Egyptologist John Romer documented the political dimension of this accumulation in detail. The Amun Oracle, a portable boat shrine called the Bark of Amun, was physically controlled by the priesthood, who could make the bark nod or tilt toward a chosen candidate during public processions. The same oracle system was used to legitimize Thutmose III's claim to the throne around 1479 BCE, documented by Thutmose himself in an inscription at Karnak. The god spoke, the priests interpreted, the political outcome was exactly what the priests needed it to be. By the 21st dynasty around 1069 BCE, the high priests of Amun began using royal cartouches around their own names, a symbol exclusively reserved for pharaohs. Then in the Khonsu temple at Karnak, the high priest Herihor was depicted performing rituals that only a pharaoh was canonically permitted to perform, offering directly to the gods without royal mediation. Ramesses II was technically still alive. Herihor simply drew himself as pharaoh anyway. The reliefs are still there. You can see them. Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen documented what came next. The period scholars call the Wehem Misut, the Renaissance, involved dated administrative documents using the high priest's own regal years rather than the pharaoh's, a deputy minister signing legislation in his own name. And by 945 BCE, the Amun priesthood had accumulated enough consolidated power to install the Libyan general Shoshenq Demir on the throne of Egypt, ending the native new kingdom entirely. The priests had become the kingmakers. The mainstream explanation is a story of institutional opportunism. A series of weak, short-reigning pharaohs after Ramesses III created a power vacuum, and the most organized institution in the country naturally filled it. The land accumulation was a result of centuries of royal gifts, not strategic seizure. The oracle system was a legitimate theological tool that both priests and pharaohs used instrumentally. It's a reasonable reading, and it fits the evidence on the surface. But the priestly land accumulation didn't slow down during periods of strong pharaohs. Thutmose III, Egypt's greatest military conqueror, presided over dramatic expansions of Karnak's holdings during his own reign. The priesthood grew powerful not in spite of strong rulers, but alongside them, which suggests the relationship was symbiotic and calculated until a certain threshold was crossed. Some historians ask whether the Amun priests were running an economic model that made institutional challenge structurally impossible. By controlling the grain supply, the shipping network, and the agricultural workforce, they ensured that any pharaoh who moved against them would trigger a famine. The oracle wasn't a spiritual tool, it was a veto mechanism. And the 600 years it took to complete the takeover suggests not a slow drift of history, but something more like a plan. When Alexander the Great visited the oracle of Amun at Siwa in 331 BCE and was declared the son of Amun, he wept. His companions reported that he emerged from the private consultation changed. What the priest told him in that inner chamber, the same hereditary priest descended from the same institutional lineage, was never recorded. Alexander went on to style himself a god king in the Egyptian tradition and founded a dynasty that ruled Egypt for 3 centuries. Whatever was said at Siwa, it worked exactly as the priest had always intended. Top 4. The Nizari Assassins of Alamut. From the Nile to the mountains of Persia, where a different kind of power was being perfected. No land, no oracle, no army worth mentioning, just a castle on a needle of rock and the most credible threat in the medieval world, the Nizari Assassins of Alamut. You are the most powerful vizier in the Seljuk Empire, effectively the prime minister of the medieval Islamic world, administrator of territory stretching from Central Asia to the Mediterranean. You are surrounded by guards. You have survived court politics, military coups, and regional revolts. You have managed an empire of millions through 4 decades of service, and you are old enough to know that every threat looks different when it comes for you. And then on the afternoon of October 16th, 1092 CE, as you are being carried in your litter from your tent to an audience chamber, a man steps from the crowd dressed as a Sufi mystic and drives a knife into your chest. His name is Butahir Arani. He is 17 years old. He smiles while he does it, and he has been embedded in your entourage waiting for months. His target was Nizam al-Mulk, the Grand Vizier of the Seljuk Empire. The man who ordered the killing had never left his castle. His name was Hassan-i Saba, and from a fortress in the Alborz Mountains of northern Persia, at an altitude of 2,100 meters above sea level, he controlled the geopolitics of the medieval world for 34 years without once walking out the front gate. Hassan-i Saba seized the fortress of Alamut in 1090 CE. Bernard Lewis, whose 1967 study, The Assassins, remains the foundational modern text, documented what followed. For 166 years, the Nizari Ismaili state operated from a network of mountain fortresses as a geopolitical force that no army could simply conquer. They were never militarily defeated. They were destroyed only when Hulagu Khan's Mongol forces arrived in 1256 with an army large enough to bury the mountain itself. The confirmed victim list is extraordinary. Nizam al-Mulk in 1092, the Fatimid Caliph al-Amir in 1130, Raymond II of Tripoli in 1152, and Conrad of Montferrat, king of Jerusalem, killed on April 28, 1192, just days after his election to the throne. Crusader chronicles document the killing in detail. The Nizari agents who did it had been posing as Christian monks in Conrad's court for months. They were recognized as the killers and no one was surprised. The embedded agent model is documented in Rashid al-Din's Chronicles, written in 1310. Nizari operatives adopted false identities and joined the households of targets as servants, scholars, or religious advisors, sometimes waiting months or years before acting. The operation against Saladin is the most famous example. Saladin was the most militarily successful leader of the medieval Islamic world. He received 2 Nizari warnings before negotiating a non-aggression pact with Alamut. First, he woke inside a heavily guarded camp to find a poisoned dagger and a note on his pillow. Then on a second occasion, hot coals had been arranged in a deliberate pattern beside his sleeping place while he slept undisturbed. The message required no translation. Saladin signed the treaty. The Alamut Library, destroyed by the Mongols in 1256, was described by the scholar Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, who was present during the siege and survived, as one of the largest repositories of scientific and theological knowledge in the medieval world, containing hundreds of thousands of volumes of astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, and theology. It burned in a single day. Everything the Nizaris knew, everything they had gathered from embedded agents across 3 continents for over a century and a half, turned to ash. Historians like Lewis argue the Nizaris were a legitimate Ismaili Shia political movement, using targeted assassination as an asymmetric strategy, the rational weapon of a militarily outnumbered minority sect trying to survive in a hostile Sunni world. The terror was instrumental, not ideological. They killed specific power holders who threatened them, and they stopped when threats were neutralized or treaties signed. That reading is supported by the evidence. It is probably largely correct. But a purely defensive strategy doesn't require years-long embedding operations that predate any specific conflict. It doesn't explain why Conrad of Montferrat, a crusader king with no territorial dispute with Alamut, was killed within days of his election by agents who had been in place well before the election happened. Someone was managing the chessboard from that mountain, and the historical record strongly suggests that other parties were paying for specific moves. Several crusader sources document payments flowing toward Alamut from European powers who needed specific Islamic leaders removed. The Nizaris, it appears, may have been selling their services to multiple clients simultaneously, a professional intelligence and enforcement organization operating under the cover of messianic theology. And then there is the library, 400 years of accumulated intelligence, astronomical observation, philosophical synthesis, and operational knowledge burned in a single afternoon by the Mongols. Or at least that is what the Mongols believed. The Nizari agents were by professional definition already scattered across the known world. Whatever they knew, some of them carried it with them when the mountain fell. Top 5. The Cathar Perfecti. From a mountain fortress in Persia, we travel west and north to the hills of southern France, where a different kind of network made the opposite strategic choice. No daggers, no castles, no armies at all, just wandering men and women in linen robes who were loved so completely by an entire region that it took a 20-year crusade to stop them. The Cathar Perfecti. Picture yourself as Pope Innocent III in the year 1206 CE. You are the most powerful man in Western Christendom. Your authority is theological, political, and military. You command the loyalty of kings, and an entire region of France, the Languedoc from the Atlantic foothills to the Pyrenees, has stopped listening to you. Not through rebellion, not through heresy declared in the public square. They have simply started following different priests, men and women who eat no meat, own nothing, travel everywhere on foot, never lie under any circumstances, and claim that the physical world was created by the devil. The local nobility protects them. The common people adore them. Your own bishops are losing public theological debates to these wanderers in village squares. And you cannot find the center. There is no cathedral to seize, no treasury to freeze, no army to defeat, just a quiet, incorruptible web of people who seem to be everywhere at once, and who will not under any pressure reveal what their deepest teachings actually say. This is the Cathar movement, and its inner core, the Perfecti, may have been the most effective underground network in medieval history. The primary sources are remarkable in their detail. The Inquisition records of Jacques Fournier, later Pope Benedict XIX, comprise 578 depositions collected between 1318 and 1325 CE, preserved in Vatican archives. They are the most granular record of any medieval underground community in existence. And what they reveal is not a chaotic spiritual movement, but a structure of extraordinary discipline and design. The Cathar Church maintained functioning bishops in at least 6 regional dioceses: Albi, Carcassonne, Toulouse, Agen, Razès, and northern France. They held a formal council at Saint-Philly-de-Caraman in 1167 CE, documented in a surviving notarial copy, at which they reorganized their episcopal structure. A meeting of bishops conducted in secret, producing written records. This was not a loose spiritual affiliation. It was a parallel institution. The initiated inner core, the perfecti, underwent a ritual called the consolamentum, a laying on of hands ceremony that was their only sacrament and created a binding network of mutual obligation. The Inquisition records show that ordinary believers, called credentes, would sometimes wait until their deathbeds to receive the consolamentum, to avoid the extreme lifestyle restrictions it imposed. The perfecti themselves ate no meat, owned nothing, traveled in pairs, and were by multiple accounts of hostile witnesses genuinely incorruptible. You could not bribe them. You could not intimidate them in the way you could intimidate people who had property to lose. The Albigensian Crusade, launched by Innocent III in 1209 CE, was the first crusade ever called against a Christian population within Europe. At the sack of Béziers on July 22, 1209, Papal legate Arnaud Amalric reportedly responded to crusaders asking how to distinguish Cathars from Catholics by giving an answer that has haunted Catholic history ever since. The soldiers killed somewhere between 7,000 and 20,000 people in a single day. The Dominican order, later the primary engine of the Inquisition, was founded specifically in response to Catharism after Saint Dominic concluded that the only way to fight a network of wandering preachers was with your own network of wandering preachers. The siege of Montségur lasted 9 months before the fortress surrendered. In March 1244, CE 200 perfecti were burned on a single pyre at dawn on March 16th. But 4 perfecti had escaped the night before the surrender, carrying something the Inquisition interrogators subsequently and specifically asked about in every torture session that followed. Not gold, not weapons, but documents and objects whose nature the surviving credentes claimed under torture not to know. The Inquisition's fixation on this question, repeated across dozens of depositions, suggests that whoever planned the escape believed what was carried out of Montségur mattered more than the lives of the people left behind. Historians argue the Cathars were a genuine dualist heresy with theological roots in Bulgarian Bogomilism, a sincere religious movement whose appeal lay in the visible moral corruption of the Catholic clergy. The network was held together by kinship and community, not conspiracy. That reading is supported by the Inquisition records themselves, which reveal a community of ordinary people, farmers, weavers, innkeepers, who sheltered perfecti and heard their sermons. Real people with real faith. But a grassroots religious movement does not maintain 6 functioning dioceses under active military suppression without organizational infrastructure that goes beyond shared belief. And the Inquisition interrogators kept returning across decades of sessions to one specific question. What left Montségur on the night of March 15th? The 4 escapees were never found. The credentes said they didn't know what was taken, which some historians note is exactly what you would tell lower-level members of a compartmentalized network if you needed them to survive an interrogation. The last confirmed Cathar perfectus, Guillaume Belibast, was burned in 1321 CE, 77 years after Montségur. The network survived underground for 3 generations after its supposed military destruction. Whatever the perfecti knew, they took extraordinary precautions to ensure that some portion of it survived them. Top 6, the Oracle Controllers of Delphi. From the hills of southern France, we travel east across the ancient world to a mountain in central Greece, where the real architects of Mediterranean power didn't operate in the dark at all. They sat in full sunlight on a marble terrace and charged admission. The Oracle Controllers of Delphi. Before you went to war, you came here. Before you founded a colony, you came here. Before you minted a new coin, signed an alliance, or chose a new king, you came here with gold, with livestock, with questions. Every Greek city-state, every Persian satrap, every Lydian merchant king, the richest man in the ancient world, Croesus of Lydia, sent talents of gold to this place and asked whether he should invade Persia. The oracle answered, he invaded. He lost everything. And he couldn't even complain because the answer had been technically correct. A great empire would fall. It was just his. This is the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. And for approximately 6 centuries, it functioned as the most sophisticated intelligence brokerage in the ancient world. The priest who ran it understood something fundamental about power. Whoever controls the interpretation of ambiguous information controls the decisions of the people who need that information most. The geological basis for the Pythia's trance states was confirmed in a landmark 2001 study by geologist Yel de Boer, toxicologist Henry Spiller, and archaeologist John Hale, published in the journals Geology and Clinical Toxicology. They identified the intersection of 2 fault lines beneath the temple, the Kurna Fault and the Delphi Fault, that emitted ethylene gas, a sweet-smelling hydrocarbon that, in low concentrations, produces dissociative euphoria and in higher concentrations causes unconsciousness. Plutarch, who was himself a Delphic priest, described the Pythia inhaling a sweet-smelling pneuma rising from a chasm in the floor of the inner chamber. The ancient descriptions match ethylene intoxication precisely. The visions were real. The geology produced them. The priests interpreted them. That interpretation function was the real product. Herodotus documents that Croesus sent 117 talents of gold, 3,000 sacrificial animals, and golden statues before receiving his famous response about Persia. Scholars H.W. Park and D.E.W. Wormel cataloged over 500 surviving Delphic responses in their 1956 study, The Delphic Oracle. Responses that directly authorized the Spartan constitution attributed to Lycurgus, the founding of the North African colony of Cyrene, Spartan military intervention in the First Messenian War, and dozens of other defining political events of the ancient Mediterranean. Every Greek colony established between 800 and 500 BCE required Delphic approval before its founding. This gave the Delphic priests something no military power possessed: a comprehensive, continuously updated geopolitical database of the entire Mediterranean world, built from the intelligence that every client state deposited along with their tribute. The sacred treasury buildings lining the processional way, one for each city-state containing their votive offerings, were simultaneously a display of devotion and a physical record of who owed what to whom. The sanctuary was the ancient world's first neutral international banking zone and an intelligence clearinghouse. Historian Barry Strauss, in his 2004 study, The Battle of Salamis, argued that the oracle's famous wooden walls response before Xerxes' invasion, interpreted by Themistocles to mean the Athenian fleet, may not have been a genuine divine utterance that happened to be correctly interpreted. Themistocles may have coordinated his interpretation with the Delphic priests before the public announcement. The Battle of Salamis saved Greek civilization. The priests of Apollo may have been its architects. Classical historians argue that Delphi's influence derived from genuine religious authority and its practical function as a neutral meeting ground. The priest's skill at ambiguous formulation simply ensured the oracle was never technically wrong. The tribute was a temple economy, not a protection mechanism. That reading is supported by the sanctuary's obvious theological sincerity. The Pythia's visions were real. The religious devotion of the staff was genuine. These were not cynical fraudsters. But a genuinely neutral institution does not charge 117 talents of gold for a consultation. It does not maintain colonial records for every Greek settlement across the Mediterranean. And Herodotus himself noted with transparent discomfort that specific oracle responses seem to consistently benefit whichever power had most recently made the largest donation. The historian Ephorus claimed the oracle was directly bribed by the Alcmaeonid family to systematically recommend Spartan intervention in Athens, and the record suggests the recommendation was delivered. If some responses were purchased, the question becomes not whether the oracle was honest, but how many answers were shaped by prior arrangement, and how many clients knew they were buying a verdict dressed as a prophecy. The oracle was silenced by Theodosius in 390 CE. The archive of colonial records and interstate communications that the sanctuary must have maintained. 6 centuries of the Mediterranean world's most sensitive political correspondence vanished. No one knows where it went. That silence, too, was probably not an accident. Top 7: The 9 Unknown Men of Ashoka. From the oracle on its mountain, we travel east across 3,000 years and an ocean to a palace in India where an emperor who had just ordered a massacre sat down and decided that the most dangerous thing in the world was not a weapon. It was an idea, and that 9 men would have to guard it for eternity. The 9 Unknown Men of Ashoka. The year is 261 BCE. You are standing on a battlefield in Kalinga, on India's eastern coast, and the Mauryan army has won. Around you are approximately 100,000 dead soldiers, 150,000 deportees, and an uncounted number of civilians. The man responsible for this, Emperor Ashoka, ruler of an empire covering 4 million square kilometers, the largest in Indian history, is also standing here, and he is not celebrating. He is looking at what he has done, and he is weeping. In the weeks that follow, he will carve his grief into stone pillars placed across the entire subcontinent, producing the most detailed self-documentation of moral crisis by any ruler in the ancient world. And then, according to a tradition so persistent that it has survived 2,000 years, he will do something else entirely. He will identify 9 men, scholars and keepers, and charge them with a single task: to protect the most dangerous knowledge humanity possesses and ensure it is never again used to produce what he is looking at. The legend of the 9 unknown men cannot be verified the way an inscription can be verified, but the intelligence infrastructure it supposedly describes is documented in extraordinary detail in the Arthashastra, attributed to Kautilya, the chief minister of Ashoka's grandfather, Chandragupta. British scholar James Prinsep first deciphered Ashoka's edicts in 1837, and what they revealed was a ruler of extraordinary administrative sophistication. The Arthashastra devotes 3 complete books to espionage, a taxonomy of approximately 40 categories of agent, from wandering monks to gambling house supervisors, and includes detailed instructions on toxicology, psychological manipulation, false flag operations, and the systematic poisoning of enemy food supplies. This was not a philosophical text. It was an operational manual. Ashoka's own Rock Edict 13 describes the Kalinga War in terms no ancient ruler had ever used publicly before: the death of 100,000 people, the deportation of 150,000 more, the subsequent death of many times that number from famine and disease. He says this caused him pain. He says he regrets it. He says that future conquests should be conquests of dharma, of righteousness, rather than territory. This is not the language of a man who has simply become more peaceful. It is the language of a man who has looked at what his administrative and military apparatus can do and decided that the apparatus itself needs to be redesigned. The tradition of the 9 unknown men, documented in Western literature by British writer Talbot Mundy in 1923, and analyzed by French researchers Louis Pauwels and Jacques Bergier in The Morning of the Magicians in 1960, assigns each guardian a specific domain: propaganda and psychological warfare, physiology, microbiology, alchemy, communication, gravitation, cosmology, light, and sociology. What is striking is not the mysticism of the legend, but how precisely these categories map onto the sections of the Arthashastra that Kautilya identifies as strategically dangerous, and that Ashoka's post-Kalinga edicts most conspicuously avoid referencing. Ashoka's rock edicts were carved in at least 5 scripts and 4 languages: Brahmi, Kharosthi, Aramaic, and Greek, across an area from modern Afghanistan to South India. The administrative infrastructure required to carve, place, and maintain hundreds of stone inscriptions across 4 million square kilometers in multiple languages simultaneously is the infrastructure of a state that knows exactly how information moves through territory and has thought carefully about how to control that movement. The mainstream explanation is straightforward. The 9 unknown men are a legend, a narrative that emerged to explain the sophistication of Mauryan statecraft by attributing it to a hidden source. Ashoka was genuinely a remarkable ruler. His post-Kalinga transformation was genuine. His intelligence apparatus was real. None of this requires a secret brotherhood. Scholars of Mauryan history are largely unanimous on this. But the Arthashastra is explicit about the suppression of certain knowledge as a state function. Not just its deployment, but its controlled restriction. And the question that some researchers continue to ask is not whether the 9 unknown men existed literally. It is whether a bureaucratic structure designed to control access to dangerous information could survive the collapse of the empire that created it, embedded in the Buddhist monastic network that Ashoka personally founded and funded. That network connected India, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and eventually China across a span of 1,000 years. The transmission of advanced mathematics, zero decimal notation, and surgical techniques from India to the Islamic world, and then to Europe between 500 and 1100 CE, remains one of the great puzzles of intellectual history. It moved through monasteries that Ashoka built. We will probably never know whether 9 men sat in a room in Pataliputra and divided the forbidden knowledge of an empire between them. But we do know that Ashoka looked at what knowledge had produced at Kalinga and made a deliberate decision about how it should be handled afterward. The decision is carved in stone in his own words in multiple languages across a subcontinent. What is not carved in stone is what he decided to do with the parts of the Arthashastra he chose not to publish. Top 8. The Pythagorean Brotherhood. From India's philosophical crisis, we move west across the ancient world to the boot of Italy, where a different keeper of forbidden knowledge built the strictest information security system in the ancient world, and then watched it get set on fire. The Pythagorean Brotherhood. You want to study with the greatest mathematician alive. You travel to Croton, a Greek colonial city on the sole of Italy's boot, and you present yourself at the door. The conditions are explained. You will not speak for 5 years. Not a word, not in public, not in private. Not to ask a question or defend yourself or explain a misunderstanding. You will attend lectures from behind a curtain so the master cannot see your face. You will be called an akusmatikoi, a listener. You will memorize 280 rules. You will not eat beans. You will not pick up anything that has fallen. You will not touch a white rooster. You will not urinate facing the sun. If you survive the silence and demonstrate your commitment, you may eventually be admitted to the inner circle, the mathematikoi, where the real teachings are kept. And if you ever breathe a word of those teachings to anyone outside the brotherhood, your fellow initiates will build an empty tomb with your name on it. You will be declared dead. You will walk the earth as a ghost. This is the Pythagorean Brotherhood, and it controlled the domestic politics of at least 2 Greek city-states for approximately 4 decades before its members were burned alive by the citizens they had been quietly governing. The primary sources are Iamblichus, writing in approximately 300 CE, Diogenes Laertius, writing around 230 CE, and Porphyry, writing around 270 CE. All are writing centuries after the events, but drawing on earlier sources now lost. What they describe is a 2-tier initiation system of remarkable precision. The akusmatikoi, the outer circle, received rules without explanations. The mathematikoi, the inner circle, received the cosmological and mathematical teachings. This compartmentalization meant that lower-level members could not reveal what they didn't know even under interrogation. The akusmata, the rules, are extraordinary in their specificity. Do not eat beans. Do not stir fire with iron. Do not step over a yoke. Do not look in a mirror beside a lamp. Do not break bread. Modern scholars have proposed various explanations for the bean prohibition, a reference to the Pythagorean belief in metempsychosis, or the transmigration of souls through animal and human bodies. A medical observation about fava bean toxicity in people with the enzyme deficiency G6PD, which causes hemolytic anemia and is common in the Mediterranean population. Or more intriguingly, a political restriction since Athenian democratic sortition used bean drawing for jury selection, and abstaining from beans was abstaining from civic participation, keeping the Brotherhood insulated from ordinary democratic accountability. The political reach of the Brotherhood is documented. Members held simultaneous magistracies in Croton, allowing the school to effectively govern the city's legal and administrative functions for decades. Archytas of Tarentum, a Pythagorean who lived from approximately 428 to 347 BCE, served as strategos, military commander, and chief magistrate of Tarentum for 7 consecutive terms, making him simultaneously the closest friend of Plato and the most powerful political figure in the region. The Brotherhood's influence extended across multiple city-states through initiated members placed in civic office. The anti-Pythagorean revolt at Croton, approximately 450 BCE, was led by a citizen named Cylon, who had been rejected for initiation. Iamblichus records that meeting houses were set on fire with members inside. Most of the Brotherhood's leadership was killed in a single night. Only those outside the building survived, and they scattered across the Greek world carrying the inner doctrine with them. The mathematician Hippasus of Metapontum had, according to Porphyry, been expelled from the Brotherhood earlier and symbolically declared dead for revealing to outsiders the proof that the square root of 2 cannot be expressed as a ratio of integers. The proof of irrational numbers, a purely mathematical fact with no obvious political content, was kept classified within the inner circle. The question of why is one that historians have never fully answered. The standard scholarly explanation is that the Pythagorean Brotherhood was a genuine philosophical school, possibly the first, that blurred the boundary between a religious community and an academic institution. The political influence was a natural consequence of educating members of the civic elite. The revolt was a democratic backlash against perceived aristocratic capture of political offices by a private club. That reading is supported by the evidence and is probably largely correct. But a genuine philosophical school doesn't need a 5-year silence requirement that serves no educational purpose. It doesn't build a 2-tier initiation system specifically designed to compartmentalize doctrine. And it doesn't classify a mathematical proof, not a political secret, not a military strategy, but a theorem about numbers, as restricted knowledge for the inner circle only, unless the deeper mathematics was connected to something the Brotherhood considered genuinely dangerous. What Pythagoras thought mathematics was for, and what the inner circle knew that the outer circle didn't, died in that burning building in Croton. Plato spent the rest of his life circling around the edges of it. Top 9. The Ogboni Society of the Yoruba. From the burning meeting houses of ancient Italy, we cross the Mediterranean and descend south along the West African coast to a kingdom where the shadow government didn't bother hiding its existence. It announced itself, sat across from the king in his own throne room, and overruled him in public. The Ogboni Society of the Yoruba. The king is sacred. In Yoruba civilization, the Oba does not merely rule. His person is divine. His feet do not touch the ground when he travels. He eats alone behind a curtain because the act of royal consumption is too holy to witness. He speaks through an intermediary. His word is the final authority of his people, backed by spiritual sanction, ancestral mandate, and the absolute hierarchical logic of one of West Africa's most sophisticated civilizations. And then the Ogboni arrive at court. They do not bow, they sit, they discuss. And when they leave, the king's decree has been quietly reversed, and there is nothing the Oba can do about it, because the society that just overruled him contains his own mother, his chief administrators, his military commanders, and the priests who conducted his coronation. To move against the Ogboni would be to move against himself. The Ogboni Society operated as a parallel judiciary across the Yoruba kingdoms of southwestern Nigeria and Benin, and it did so not in secrecy, but in explicit, acknowledged institutional authority. The British colonial officer, Richard Lander, documented its existence and power in the 1820s and 30s, finding a functioning organization whose verdicts in land disputes in capital cases were final, non-appealable even to the Oba, and whose membership crossed every social boundary in Yoruba society. Rank, gender, ethnic origin, and religious affiliation. It was in structural terms a cross-kingdom neutral arbitration body with judicial supremacy over the monarchy, and it had been operating for centuries before any European knew it existed. The physical artifacts confirm the antiquity. The Idan Ogboni, paired male and female bronze figures, joined by a chain worn by senior initiates as identification. have been dated by thermoluminescence analysis of associated ceramic materials to as early as the 14th century CE. They are held in the British Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Smithsonian. Their consistent iconography across centuries and multiple kingdoms suggests a centralized manufacturing or commissioning process, an institution with enough organizational coherence to maintain visual standards across generations and geography. Anthropologist Peter Morton Williams, in his landmark 1960 study, The Yoruba Ogboni Cult, documented the membership structure in detail. Initiates included the Oba's own palace officials, the heads of trade guilds, senior women traders known as Ayalode, Muslim clerics in syncretized communities, and in many kingdoms, the Oba's own mother, the Iya Oba, who held one of the society's highest internal ranks. This cross-rank, cross-gender structure was not accidental. It was precisely what made the society impossible to dismantle without dismantling the functioning administrative infrastructure of the entire kingdom simultaneously. The initiation system was graduated, revealing the society's core theological teaching in layers. The publicly accessible frame was a theology centered on Ishle, earth, as the ultimate judge of human action. Initiates swore oaths to the earth witnessed by the society rather than the king, which made their primary allegiance structurally prior to royal authority. The inner theological content shared only at senior initiation levels was not recorded in writing. It was transmitted through oral praise poetry, called oriki, encoded with doctrine in a form that could not be intercepted, transcribed, or destroyed without eliminating the living practitioners entirely. During the collapse of the Oyo Empire under Fulani military pressure between 1817 and 1836 CE, documented by the Anglican bishop Samuel Ajayi Crowther, who grew up in Oyo, Ogboni networks maintained social organization and dispute resolution across communities whose formal political structures were disintegrating. The society functioned as a continuity of governance system independent of the monarchy it nominally served. When the monarchy collapsed, the Ogboni kept operating. Anthropologists characterize the Ogboni as a legitimate counterbalancing institution, a council of elders with ritual protection, preventing royal tyranny in a system where the Oba held enormous formal power. The secrecy was protective rather than conspiratorial. An advisory body needs confidentiality to function honestly. That reading is supported by the society's demonstrable functions and its obvious integration into Yoruba civic life. But a counterbalancing institution doesn't teach its doctrine in graduated secret layers. It doesn't use initiation objects as cross-kingdom identification tokens, allowing members to recognize each other without prior introduction. And it doesn't survive reconstituted through 600 documented years of colonial occupation, Christian missionary campaigns, Islamic expansion, and multiple empire collapses, unless its institutional resilience goes beyond shared cultural values. The Reformed Ogboni fraternity, founded in 1914 as a Christianized version of the original society, continues to claim membership among Nigeria's legal, military, and political elite. Some branches operate openly, others do not. Whether the contemporary institution carries the deep institutional memory of the original or merely its symbols is a question its senior members have not answered publicly. The Alamut Library burned in 1256. The Karmashian archives were destroyed or scattered when their state collapsed in 1077. The Delphic archive vanished in 390 CE. The Cathar texts were burned by the Inquisition. The Mithric scriptures were buried or destroyed in 391. In every case, the documentation of the inner doctrine disappears at the exact moment when the organization is most threatened. That pattern is either the most consistent coincidence in the history of institutions or it is policy. Pull back now and look at all 10 together. The Eleusinian priests and the Mithric patres controlled access to altered states of consciousness and sold that access to every person who wanted to govern the ancient world. The Amun priesthood and the Delphic oracle controllers built information monopolies, one through land and labor, the other through intelligence and ambiguity, and used those monopolies to shape decisions their clients believed they were making freely. The Nizaris and the Karmatians achieved strategic deterrence through demonstrated willingness to escalate, operating as geopolitical contractors under the cover of religious ideology. The Cathari and the Pythagorean Brotherhood built compartmentalized cell structures with graduated revelation systems that survived military suppression for generations. The Ogboni Society embedded judicial authority inside the civic infrastructure of the kingdoms it nominally served, making itself impossible to dismantle without dismantling the state. And Ashoka's unnamed network, whether it existed literally or as a policy decision, attempted something more ambitious than any of the others, to suppress the knowledge of mass destruction itself and hide that suppression in plain sight inside a public conversion to nonviolence. The mainstream reading of all 10 is rational and worth taking seriously. Mystery cults met genuine psychological needs. Priestly classes accumulated economic advantages through a combination of royal generosity and institutional efficiency. Secret societies provided community and mutual protection in dangerous environments. Asymmetric military actors used the tools available to them. These explanations are fair. They are probably partly right in every case, but they share one convenient feature. They make all of these organizations passive products of circumstance rather than engines of design. What the actual evidence keeps suggesting, from the Harris Papyrus to the Inquisition depositions, from Rashid al-Din's chronicles to Morton Williams' fieldwork, is that the most effective of these organizations were not simply exploiting the systems they operated inside. They were architecting those systems layer by layer over generations in ways that made their own removal structurally catastrophic for the institutions that would have had to do the removing. Most people walk through the ruins of these civilizations and see the monuments, temples, fortresses, stone pillars, and burning pyres. They accept the textbook explanation of institutional drift and move on. But you stayed here all the way to the end, which means your mind is running a different program. You understand that monuments don't build themselves, that someone decided what they were for, that someone decided who got inside. You're asking who that was. That is the right question, and it is the one historians are least comfortable answering. This channel exists for people who refuse to accept that the most consequential forces in history left no fingerprints. They left fingerprints everywhere. We just have to know what we're looking at. Every civilization that has ever lasted built two things: a visible face and a hidden engine. The face gets into the textbooks, the temples, the emperors, the dates, the battles. The engine gets quietly buried, its records burned, its members scattered to the wind. But engines leave traces, a mathematical brotherhood's inner doctrine echoing through Platonic philosophy, a priestly family's land records sitting in a museum basement, a stolen stone with 3 silver-repaired cracks. The shadows are never completely dark, and once you learn to read what has been deliberately removed from the record, history stops looking like a story. It starts looking like a message. If these hidden engines of history have changed how you view the world's power structures, please subscribe and like this video. We are unearthing the history they tried to bury. Plant the seeds of the future with us. The next treasure of knowledge will be open soon.